Look at this guy, T. Nguyen. He's a professor at the University of Utah, and he's a prominent young philosopher. I'm also a professor of philosophy, and I regard Nguyen as maybe the most interesting and dynamic young philosopher working today. And even though most of the stuff we academic philosophers work on is deeply boring, Nguyen has this thing about Twitter. He thinks that the essence of Twitter is what he calls high context speech. And all that that really means is that the speech can only be understood when the speaker and the audience share a kind of context. They share some background knowledge. Nguyen thinks that every time you tweet, you are trusting that your audience shares this context. He thinks that every tweet is like a trust fall. He says, Twitter incentivizes its users to take trust falls, and then it rewards other users for blocking the catch. He thinks that one of the features that Twitter provides, I won't keep it a secret until the end, I'll just tell you, it's the retweet, betrays that trust. It strips away that context. And as I'll explain, that's why Twitter is addictive, and also why it's often cruel. The question is, why does high context speech make Twitter addictive, and how exactly is a retweet a betrayal of that? The answer starts with the philosophy of humor, which actually goes back at least to Aristotle's Rhetoric, written in Greek in the 4th century BCE, but really hits its stride with the work of Ted Cohen, a philosophy professor at the University of Chicago in the 1990s. Cohen had this theory that did not apply to all humor. It just applied to jokes, one-liners, a setup and a punchline. He thought that the humor of a joke came from the sudden, almost instantaneous appearance or emergence of shared background knowledge. For example, here's a joke, maybe a slightly offensive one. The thing about German food is that no matter how much you eat, an hour later, you're hungry for power. That joke is only funny if you have some shared background knowledge. You have to know of the stereotype, maybe an offensive one, of Germany or Germans as hungry for power. But wait, it's not enough for the speaker and the audience to share some background knowledge. That shared knowledge has to be hidden. It would ruin the joke if I told you beforehand, okay, so before I tell you this joke, remember that there's this stereotype about Germans, that they're hungry for power, and blah, 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 blah. Then you would see the punchline coming from a mile away. It wouldn't be funny. Instead, the shared background knowledge has to just sort of emerge in the middle of the joke, once the joke is already mostly done. And that's the way, according to Cohen, that jokes all involve a certain kind of hope, a certain kind of trust. In order for them to work, you cannot check beforehand whether that background knowledge is there. You have to just trust that it is. And this idea that humor is a sort of sudden release of tension, this goes back at least to the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, who wrote a book about humor in Latin in 1709. That's actually where the term humor, meaning comedy, comes from. The humors were these liquids in the body, blood and phlegm and bile, and there was pressure that built up in the human body, and laughter was the sudden release of that pressure. So this is how Cohen thinks that jokes work. You have to trust that your audience is going to share this thing with you, this background context, this background knowledge. And then when all of a sudden in the middle of the joke, it's revealed that yes, you do share this thing with your audience, that's where at least part of the humor comes in. As Nguyen puts it, every joke is a trust fall, and every laugh is a direct experience of connection. What does this have to do with Twitter? The characteristic feature of Twitter that distinguishes it from all other forms of media is the character limit. You only have 280 characters, so you can't provide the background information. You just have to assume that it's there. Here's like an utterly silly example from Scott Shapiro, who's a law professor at Yale University. From a cybersecurity perspective, the cloud is so much more secure because the servers are very high up and hard to reach. That joke is not sophisticated, but I kind of like it. You go along thinking that this is a normal sort of serious tweet about cybersecurity, and then only at the end, all of a sudden, all at once, do you put it together that, oh, this dingus thinks that cloud storage is in actual clouds. The speaker and the audience have to share this background knowledge. They have to share the knowledge that there's this thing, it's cloud data storage, but it doesn't actually involve clouds, but it does use the word cloud. They have to share all of that. And they also have to share maybe this idea that like some people who talk about cybersecurity don't know what they're talking about. And the tweet can't start by explaining that stuff. It just has to hope that the audience understands it. But this is a pretty like tame tweet, and almost all of the audience is going to get it, so it's not a huge risk, but it is a kind of risk. Twitter doesn't just consist of jokes. There are serious tweets as well, but the paradigm tweets, not the threads, but just, one tweet that stands on its own, it can't explain everything. It has to assume this shared background knowledge between the speaker and the audience. But, says Nguyen, the mechanism for context shedding is built directly into Twitter. It's the retweets. A couple of unlucky retweets, and suddenly your tweet is splayed across tens of thousands of screens of people who don't share your background context, who can't interpret your tweet properly. Jokes are read straight. Ironic mockeries of racism are read as actual racism. This kind of thing is so familiar that new media scholars even have a name for it: context collapse. Part of the point here, of course, is that there is no such thing as Twitter. There's all these different Twitters. There's Black Twitter and academic Twitter and Star Wars Twitter and law school Twitter. These are all communities of people that share a bunch of background knowledge. They share a context. And then when one of these tweets gets ripped out of that context, everybody misunderstands it. That's exactly like a trust fall where no one catches you, where you fall and you hit the floor. Now, you might be tempted to think that people who tweet things that get ripped out of context, well, they're just foolish. They've just made a mistake. They forgot that they were speaking in a public forum that anyone could see. But understanding Cohen's theory of jokes shows that the individual users are not making some foolish mistake. Twitter is designed for this. It incentivizes people to make pithy, short little statements where they can't give all of the context, to get sort of addicted to doing this, to throwing out something in the hopes that a whole bunch of other people, maybe thousands of them, are gonna catch it, are gonna catch you. Twitter is addictive in the same way that stand-up comedy is addictive. You get up in front of a group of strangers, and then through this act of high context speech, you reveal that you're not really so estranged from one another at all. But what Nguyen is suggesting is that the retweet function sort of works as if the stand-up comedy club would just take some jokes out of context and share them with a whole bunch of people that weren't in the room. That's why Twitter is addictive, and that's why, according to Nguyen, it involves a kind of betrayal of trust. Oh, so follow me on Twitter, @JIKaplan. Okay.